Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. In our show notes, you'll find links to our ad-free premium version, our other shows, and our wind-down box, a quarterly sleep subscription box full of products I've picked out myself to bring a little more joy and ease to your bedtime. You may have heard of the word sonder, which was coined by the author and neologist John Koenig in his work, The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. He described it as follows. Sonder, noun. The realization that each random passerby is living a life as vivid and complex as your own. Populated with their own ambitions, friends, routines, worries, and inherited craziness. An epic story that continues invisibly around you, like an anthill sprawling deep underground, with elaborate passageways to thousands of other lives that you'll never know existed, in which you might appear only once, as an extra sipping coffee in the background, as a blur of traffic passing on the highway, as a lighted window at dusk. That feeling is what inspires my stories of nothing much. Just gentle documentation of everyday life, though I own that they are idealized versions of that, and intentionally so. Come escape with me for a bit. We'll do some grown-up daydreaming because it can feel good and be healing and remind us that even when the world is hard, there are still things to celebrate and be soothed by. All my stories take place in what I call the Village of Nothing Much. And sometimes you'll notice moments when the storylines overlap and connect. You might wonder, oh, is this the same person who told the story last time? Or that story from a few weeks ago? And, depending on the story, it might be. We are working on creating a big map that shows all the story connections. But till then, I'll give you some extra details at the end of the episode. And now, because I just think it will help you feel good, let's take a deep breath in through the nose and sigh from your mouth. Do it one more time. Breathe in and out. Good. Our stories today celebrate some close-to-home summer pleasures. We'll start with yard sale, pulling our little red wagon along the sidewalks and browsing treasures. Then we'll find a shady spot to watch the wind in the branches and doze off in a midsummer's afternoon nap. Finally, we'll pack the picnic basket and meet a couple friends at the park a block from home to share lunch and watch the clouds shift in summer feast. Yard sale, or another man's treasure. We'd hatched a plan for this weekend way back in the spring, when we'd all gotten together to pitch in for a neighborhood cleanup. Honestly, it had been a lot of fun. We'd planted flowers and raked the dried leaves out from under the shrubs in the empty lot. We gathered up litter and helped a few neighbors with chores they couldn't manage on their own. After a long winter in my house, I'd enjoyed every minute of it. The physical exertion, the conversations with my neighbors, and the satisfied feeling at the end of the day as we surveyed what we'd done. We stayed in touch after that. We'd organized a seed swap for the gardeners, a casual potluck in the park, and a sidewalk chalk art contest with the neighborhood kids. That had been a lot of fun. We'd given them a theme, something about summer vacations, and one evening, everyone came out and walked from one to the other, admiring all the art. Some of it was quite simple, just some stick figures and blue waves. Some was, abstract, probably done by very little ones who were just happy to be outside scribbling on the concrete. And a couple families had gone all out, with Halloween skeletons brought up from the basement, dressed in Hawaiian shirts and board shorts, propped up beside seascapes that took up a whole yard's worth of sidewalk, or a lawn full of pup tents and drawings of summer camp, complete with fire pit and marshmallows ready to toast. It had been such fun that we were already planning another for the fall, and a decoration and light contest for December. And this weekend was another one of our big ideas. We were having a neighborhood yard sale, and hoping to attract some folks from all over the village to come poke through our old lamps, board games, and casserole dishes. Last night I'd helped put up signs at the entrance to our neighborhood, hand-painted ones with metal prongs sandwiched in between the cardboard that we pushed into the grass. The sale would go from 10 to 5, and we'd even arranged for a local charity to come by with their big truck at the end of the day to gather all the leftover bits for donation. Now it was the morning of, and the whole neighborhood seemed to be getting in on it. People were setting out card tables in their driveways, arranging their inventory on storage shelves in their garages, and a few enterprising kids were setting up a lemonade stand by the edge of the park. Some households had lots to sell, with old bicycles and bed frames and buffet tables lining their sidewalks, and others had only a few items up for grabs. I was in the latter category, and a friend down the street had offered me space in her own garage, so I didn't have to sit alone with my crate of old records, my collection of kitschy salt and pepper shakers, and my well-intended but never used snowshoes. My things were piled into my little red wagon, and I set off down the street. And as I was in no hurry, I decided to do a little browsing on my way there. I pulled my wagon up in front of a yard full of comic books. This neighbor was wise. She'd set out a few beanbag chairs under a big beach umbrella beside the racks of comics, which I'm sure would prove tempting to more than a few customers. Besides the comics, she also had lots of photo books, and I flipped through one showing snow-capped mountains and wild landscapes. I was getting to know my neighbors as I walked from driveway to driveway. The next yard was full of sports equipment, skis and skateboards, a volleyball net and posts rolled up in a long box, and a whole table full of softball mitts and bats. Across the street, I perused a beautiful collection of doll houses, all made by hand. I looked in the tiny windows to spy the dining table laid for dinner, the grandfather clock beside the stairs, seeming to tick, and a playroom with its own dollhouse, a minuscule replica of the one I was admiring. Gosh, my neighbors were interesting. Traffic was beginning to pick up, cars stopping here and there, and some bargaining going on in nearly every driveway. I tugged on the handle of my wagon and meandered a little more purposefully toward my friend's sale. The house kitty corner to hers was the one I'd always loved. It had a broad front porch that you'd want to sit on every summer evening, maybe even when it was raining, to smell the fresh air and listen to the drops coming down. I'd helped here, along with a few others, during that spring cleanup, to take the storm windows down from their hooks and store them in the garage. And I was so happy to see the man who lived in this house out on his porch, enjoying the day with us. We'd planted bright red petunias in his flower boxes, and they stood out sharply against the white clapboard siding. They were cascading over the edge of their boxes now, with lots of pretty blooms. I stopped to chat with him from the sidewalk, asking if he was planning on doing some shopping today. He said he liked to watch from the porch swing, and also that he had his own item to sell. He gestured to the upright piano visible through his front window. He said he didn't play much anymore, but that it was a shame to let it sit and fall out of tune. I promised to spread the word, thinking I would keep a lookout for a few wide boards to help move it down the front steps, and that certainly one of the families around here would be happy to give it a new home. We waved goodbye for now, and I crossed the street to set up my items. There was a table set aside for me, and I'd brought an old tablecloth to make my stuff look a little nicer. I shook it out and spread it over the surface and artfully arranged my inventory. I set the crate of records on its side and fanned out the ones I thought might be most of interest to customers. The salt and pepper shakers were lined up in order from silliest to least hokey, and my snowshoes had their sale tag facing out. I was ready for business. A midsummer afternoon's nap. Now we were here, at the halfway mark of the season. Or, I guess a little past it. Not that the seasons followed the calendar very precisely anyway. I'd seen it snow in late May and ridden my bike on a few hot February days. The frost had come early, the spring melt had shown up weeks late, and midsummer was, after all, a feeling more than a precise moment. And these days it felt like midsummer. The tomatoes were growing thick and numerous on the vines, but they hadn't turned red or even pink yet. Each morning when I went to look at them, they looked back, stubbornly green, and I'd begun threatening to make fried green tomatoes any day now. The heat was steady, nearly every day was sunny and warm and long, and the first spurt of enthusiasm for all things summer had run its course. I'd been swimming at the beach, camping under the stars, road tripping, and farmers market shopping. Now was the part of the summer when I had settled into the ease of the season. I was maybe even taking it for granted, something my future winter self would cluck her tongue at. I felt I had so many sunny days that I could waste them, which is a luxurious feeling, and today I was leaning into it. I could be weeding the garden or taking a long bike ride down the dirt roads around my house. I could be putting up jars of blueberry jam or cleaning out the garage while the weather was still good. But instead, I was planning a nice, long afternoon nap. I'd finished my lunch, which I'd eaten sitting on my front porch, a big fresh salad with lettuce from the garden, thick slices of avocado and toasted sesame seeds, all dressed with just olive oil and lemon juice and a sprinkle of salt. Whenever I made a simple salad, especially if it's just the lettuce leaves, I think of a joke my dad used to make. He called it a honeymoon salad, as in lettuce alone. And I chuckled as I'd eaten it. I sipped at a cold glass of homemade blackberry agua fresca and noticed a breeze picking up in the yard. Sometimes I got lost just looking at the rippling leaves and petals in my flower gardens. The hydrangeas were growing so big that their heavy heads toppled toward the ground. My hydrangea blooms were a lovely shade of pinkish purple. Last year they'd all been bright pink, and of course that was very pretty, but I'd been fiddling with the soil to see if I could get them to change color. Their color depends on the acidity of the soil, you see, and I'd been talking to a few people at my garden club, and they told me that it would likely take a year or more, but I could shift them to blue by adding some particular ingredients to their environment. Ground coffee, pine needles, and compost. had all gone in since last fall, and the flowers that were blooming now showed a sort of halfway mark between the two colors, a rosy sunset indigo. I loved picking them at their peak and enjoying them on the kitchen table or in the front window, but I was waiting to pick a majority of them to dry for the winter. And for that purpose, you want them to begin to dry at least a bit on the plant. When the petals start to feel a little papery and the color is fading just a bit, you go out in the morning once the dew has dried and snip them, leaving a long stem on each bloom. Then put a few stems in each vase and add a couple inches of water, and then just let them be. Set them away from direct sunlight and let the water naturally evaporate. And in a few weeks, you'll have perfectly dried hydrangeas with their colors intact. Each year, I'd cut enough to slip one stem under the ribbon of each Christmas gift and birthday gift I'd give over the winter. A bit of summer preserved. But today, I was not doing that. Not doing many of the little chores and tasks waiting for me all over the house. They could all be done another day. Today, I felt like my flowers, heavy-headed and drooping toward the ground. I carried my half-full glass of agua fresca down the steps of the porch and headed around to the back. I'd hung a hammock between two giant elm trees, and its shady spot was perfect for afternoon dozing. I drank the last few sips out of my cup and tucked it into the roots of one of the trees. I was an expert hammock user by now and knew that the best way to get in was just to sit at one edge, kick my shoes off, and then pivot as I flopped back and let myself be caught in the cradle of fabric. It swung for a while, and I closed my eyes, just feeling the momentum run down, as if I were the pendulum of a clock that needed winding. I smiled, thinking that was exactly what I was. I needed winding, and each moment of the coming nap would turn the key until my gears were running smoothly again. When the hammock was still, I opened my drowsy eyes to look up through the branches. There was a whole village up in those crooks and knots and leaves. Birds nesting, squirrels nimbly racing through the boughs, leaves catching up the sunlight and carrying it into the tree to make more leaves to catch more sunlight. I noticed that between the canopy of one tree and another, there was a small space, a sort of open expanse, so that one tree didn't crowd the other. And from the back of my sleepy brain, a term for it stumbled forward. They called that crown shyness, and I liked it. It felt friendly, not shy to me, like the natural world's version of good fences making good neighbors. I could feel the nap coming, and I let my eyes close again. It was midsummer, and we still had so many bright, warm days to cut flowers and grow tomatoes and stay up late till the fireflies came out. Summer feast. I'd found the basket at a yard sale. I'd been out for a walk in my neighborhood the autumn before, and as I turned a corner, found a row of houses with tables set up in their driveways and blankets laid out over their front lawns, all covered with formerly precious objects that were now ready for a new home. I'd strolled through the offerings and found a few things I'd been happy to carry away with me. There were some funny clip-on earrings in the shape of sunflowers that hadn't likely been worn since the 70s. a few spy novels with dusty book jackets that seemed perfect for afternoon reading on the porch, and a lovely wicker basket with sturdy handles and lined with a red checked cloth that looked like it could hold a hearty lunch to be eaten on a sunny summer day. When I'd gotten it home and given it a thorough cleaning, I'd been so eager to use it that I kept it out on my kitchen table for a week or so, waiting for a warm, bright day to fill it with sandwiches and cookies and crisp autumn apples. But instead, winter had come early, and as the first snow of the season was falling outside, I'd regretfully stashed the basket in a cupboard to wait for next year's sunny days. Now we were in the sweetest, warmest days of summer, and the basket was once again out on my table, its wicker flaps tipped up and ready to be filled. The excitement of a meal with friends in a shady green spot and my somewhat out-of-control vegetable garden meant that I had a lot to fill it with. I'd made a crunchy cucumber salad with tart vinegar and feathery fronds of dill that had spent the morning marinating in the fridge. When I'd eaten the last pickled beet from the jar the night before, rather than pouring the liquid out, I'd dropped some thinly sliced onions in and sealed it back up. Today I drained them out and found that they were sweet and tangy and a beautiful pink that made the cucumber salad feel ready for a party. Along with the cucumbers, the garden had given me a glut of green tomatoes. I cut them into thick slices and sautéed them with shallots and thyme and balsamic vinegar until they were syrupy and caramelized. Then I laid them into my tart pan on top of a homemade crust that was a bit lumpy and lopsided, which I decided I would call rustic. I'd folded the edges of the dough over the filling a bit and baked it off. When it was cool, I'd cut the tart into wedges and wrapped them in wax paper, and into the basket they'd gone. I ticked things off on my fingers. Salad, tart, plates, napkins, and forks. Looking around the kitchen, I remembered the sweet cherries I'd rinsed in a colander in the sink and found a bowl to seal them in, and just managed to fit it in the basket. I pulled a blanket down from the hall closet, the one I took to outdoor concerts and to watch the fireworks from on the 4th of July, and fitted over the wicker top, pulling the handles up and around. Soon I was out the door with my sun hat on my head and the basket heavy in my hands. Luckily, I didn't have far to go. Up one block and around a corner, there was a tiny neighborhood park. Just a stretch of green grass with a gravel path curving through it and a few benches. On one were a couple of friends, chatting as they waited for me, with their own contributions to the feast on their lap. We laid out the blanket at the edge of the park, where there was a bit of shade under a catalpa tree, and pinned the corners down with what we'd brought. I unpacked the basket and laid out the dish of cucumber salad, the bowl of sweet cherries, and the wrapped pieces of green tomato tart. My friends applauded the menu and filled their plates. To go with our lunch, one friend brought a chilled thermos of homemade lemonade that she'd sweetened with lavender syrup. She unpacked glasses and poured some for each of us. The other friend had a tin of homemade cookies, and he popped off the top to show us. They looked crispy and delicious, with crisscross hatch marks on top, made with the tines of a fork. We handed round napkins and forks, and leisurely ate, sometimes leaning back on our hands and stretching our legs out of the cover of the shade to let them warm in the sun. The tart crust had stayed crisp, and the tomatoes were rich and tender. The cucumber salad had been tasty when I'd tried a forkful this morning, but now that it had spent a few more hours with its flavors blending, it was really delicious, and we went back for more until the bowl was empty. The cherries were sweet and juicy, and I dropped the pits into the grass, wondering if I might come back in 20 years to find a tree grown up in our favorite spot. We took a break from eating for a bit and laid down on the blanket with our heads together and our eyes turned up to the sky. It was bright blue, a kind of blue that when you stop to really look at it, is honestly astonishing. Have you had those moments? When you take a closer look at something you see every day and feel just plain knocked out by it? A few clouds were moving very slowly across the sky, and we pointed out shapes to one another as we had when we were children. I saw a horse in mid-gallop, and as I watched, its nose stretched out in front of it, and its flanks lifted and shifted until it had become a dragon with wings open in a glacially slow flap. I turned my head and saw among the grass and seed pods that had dropped from the tree the wide leaves of whistleweed. I plucked a piece and lined it up so that the strip of green was stretched in a straight line between my thumbs. I pressed my lips to the spot and blew and found I could still make the loud honking call I'd learned to in summer camp. My friends laughed at the sound, and we all realized why our camp counselor had begged us to quit all those years ago. The tin of cookies was passed around, and we ate them, still lying on our backs, watching the clouds moving across the sky. My mother used to say, when we sat down to the table for dinner, "We don't eat, we dine." It was a reminder to take time to savor our meals instead of gulping them down and rushing on to the next thing. It was also probably meant to insert a little civility into our family dinners, to teach manners and a bit of propriety. I liked thinking that in the end, good manners are really just about showing regard for the people around you, and that it can be done while you're lying in the grass with cookie crumbs in your hair. I curled onto my side and tucked my arm under my head. The warm air and my full belly were making me drowsy. I listened while my friends talked about this and that and let my eyes close, knowing they were watching over and that we had no place to be. These stories were all written years apart, but I'm sure you can feel the commonalities in them. To me, the best bits of summer are the slowed down moments of quiet enjoyment. I think the heat makes me slow, and like a happy sloth, I lean into it. The first story has two titles, Yard Sale or Another Man's Treasure, and I am 100% sure that the idea for that was planted into my Saturday morning cartoon watching brain by the Rocky and Bullwinkle show. At the end of each of their cliffhanger episodes, the narrator would announce the title for the next episode, and it was always two titles, like Bullseye Bullwinkle or Destination Moose. And I think that was a throwback itself to Sam Spade's stories on the radio in the 40s. Anyway, when I started naming episodes and realized I could give them this or version, well, it's kind of amazing that I use it rarely. This episode is a sequel to Spring Cleanup, which appears in episode 21 of this podcast. And it features the character of the man selling his piano, and he's going to show up in more stories coming up soon. On a personal level, I am not a fan of yard sales. My wife loves them, especially estate sales, and it's really more fun for her if I do not go with her. I get overstimulated in those situations, especially around antiques, which I can't explain it, but I feel like I can feel their histories, and it can overwhelm me really easily. Antique stores feel chaotic to me. But as I frequently say, these stories aren't about me. And while I don't enjoy yard sales, I can find something charming about the idea of them. At least I hope I did, and that you agree. Now, the Midsummer afternoon nap story was based on a feeling I had one day, and actually it was the beginning of the summer, not the midsummer, that I had enough summer ahead of me to waste some. A feeling of such wealth of sunshine that I could afford to draw the curtains and sleep through some of it. I live in Michigan, and while we aren't known for it, it is true that we tend to have a lot of cloudy days here. We're actually cloudier than parts of the country that are famous for being cloudy. I've read that it has something to do with being in this basin between the Great Lakes and the clouds get sort of stuck. So the sunlight means a whole lot to Michiganders, and to have enough of it to waste was this decadent feeling that became a whole story. Oh, and if you do dry some hydrangeas, let me know how it goes. I have used the method in the story for years, which I learned from the lovely Nancy Birtwistle of British Bake Off fame. Finally, the summer feast story. This is one of those stories that I had completely forgotten about. And when I reread it as I prepped for this episode, I really loved it. Sometimes my stories are like dreams. They're so vivid when I am in the middle of them. And then as soon as I step away, it's like I wake up from the world of nothing much and they dissolve. And I remember very little about them. So this was like a lovely surprise. I love that it was already foreshadowing the yard sale that I would write about a couple years later. And that cucumber salad, which no, I do not have a recipe for, but hey, you don't need one. It's really good. Just dice some cucumbers, add herbs and oil and vinegar, and let it sit a bit. Try it this week. Thank you for spending this time with me, for letting me tell you a bit about Sonder and some daydreams I've had. I wish you a wonderful week full of simple, soft moments. Please be gentle with yourself.